affirm, the resolution is a question about whether certain individuals have a moral obligation to assist others, which is ethically contextualized in terms of beneficence, Tambochan. The term beneficence is understood in ethical theory to include an action to prevent to the promote of good other persons. The English rule refers to a moral obligation to act for the benefit of others, often by preventing or removing possible harm. And the resolution, the phrase "in need" implies need as a noun, in that a state of being. Need as a noun is defined by the Oxford American Dictionary as a state of lacking basic necessities and requiring help. Moral obligations are defined by Random House Dictionary as an act to which a person is morally bound by considerations of right and wrong. Thus, moral obligations are only binding in the sense that they are necessary for a person to be moral. A person can choose to be immoral. This indicates that the resolution requires the act to defend an obligation of individuals to others that like basic necessities. Make them check and CX before engaging in theory in order to avoid pointless theory debates so we can actually focus on substance. We must approach the topic from the non-ideal because that is what beneficence deals with, Liam Murphy explains. The thought that beneficence for the government suggests that we tend to view beneficence in terms of collective responsibility. In this sense, beneficence is different from other moral obligations. Though each person is not sure what his or her responsibility is, what seems evident is that most other people are falling short. The practically relevant question is thus a question of non-ideal theory. That is what a given person is required to do in circumstances where at least some other people are not doing what they are supposed to do. Furthermore, the moral agents of resolution are individuals and the moral subjects are people in need, because A, topic literature discusses whether the generally more affluent members of society are obligated to help the worse off, and B, the term in need modifies people and therefore refers to a distinct status of vulnerability, whereas the unmodified term individuals refers to an abstract group. So, normative frameworks that analyze asymmetrical relationships are marginated to the resolution. Observation 1 is epistemology. Our upbringing and social structures shape our worldview, Sayers. A moral framework can constitute for our identities. It is a self-solution to think we do not speak from a moral orientation. These self-violations are not the purely subjective preferences derived by motivism. They are constitutive of the self and its ability to have preferences. Such values are given, not chosen. The individual is born into a particular community with no choice. The self develops from the frameworks of values and allegiances which membership of groups involves. Identity is created through such frameworks. The individual cannot reject them without denying his own identity. And even if we can make choices after our values are shaped by socialization, our identities are play a role in how we treat by society and how we view ourselves per other social groups, Sayers too. The autonomy of the self develops as a product of social conditions and is stamped with its origins informed by them. Family, sex, class, race, and nation are formative of identity and still often constitute social faith with respect to which autonomy is developed. Therefore, even if we don't agree with society on what's right and what's wrong, society forms a conception of at least we know that there is a such thing as right and wrong, which is what morality deals with. Therefore, arguments that deal with individuals outside of their social context are irrelevant since it is impossible to have knowledge absent an examination of those constraints. Finally, ethical theories that create moral rules without having reference in the current social context fail to analyze asymmetries in wealth and treatment, Charles Mills explains. Ideal theory enables you to say when a society is unjust, but it falls short of the ideal, not what you do when you find yourself in an unjust society. You want to correct that injustice. So it is an ideal with no practical worth. What is required by the non-ideal starts with reality and seeks a means to correcting them. To try and advertise the black disadvantage to affirmative action is not discriminate. The ideal is to guide us in a world without reason. Makes it be attractive one seeks the ideal, completely ignoring the non-ideal theory that is given whites a systematic advantage and so conflates as discrimination attempts to draw racial distinctions. So what is ideally called for under ideal circumstances is not what is called for under non-ideal circumstances. So first, ideal theory is never supposed to be an end in itself, but as a means to improving our handling of non-ideal matters. And second, it is questionable how useful the ideal ever would have been. This explains that ideal theory tells us what to do to create when we want to create an ideal society from scratch, but given that we have to make actions in relation to a society that already exists, it cannot correct injustice and therefore is useless. So, our ethical obligations must also involve certain positive duties to correct systemic injustice, because non-interference alone would ignore the non-ideal. And ideal theory therefore collapses the non-ideal because ideal circumstances can only be referenced from the status quo. Observation 2 is the ethical framework. I value morality per the valid term ought. Since morality must guide action, it assumes that humans have value that makes actions result in good and bad tailored. Unexpected the definition of worth is the obligation of self-fulfillment. If this is valid, then the doctrine of rights is not independent from social condition. People cannot develop their human potential outside of society. We cannot describe rights without affirming the worth of human capacities, and this affirmation has normative consequences that we should foster these capacities in ourselves, since these capacities can only develop in society. We have to sustain society, provide a social thesis without the privacy of rights is impossible. We're all responsible for the messages our community makes while shaping society. We allow for particular norms to be important, but it is most important that individuals shape the society together. Nozick explains. The point is not to accomplish a particular purpose, but to speak in the name of society about what it holds dear. Individual might only speak for himself, but to live in a society lays you up to be ashamed of things which you are not responsible, to be proud of the things which you have not done. To stop identifying with that society, we stop identifying with our sense of self. Thus, we have an obligation to the community that is the only way to respect human worth, since we recognize with the community's actions and disadvantages. So the criterion is the maintenance of communal norms that allows for it to flourish. I contend that the community requires assisting others. First, mutual aid is necessary for a conception of society to exist cohesively. A public action requires a frame of mind by which people think of themselves as members of a common world. Public action emphasizes liberation from self-absorption, so people participate in the common good. Altruism is concerned for people whom public actions are done, not a private bond. Second, a pure individual focus cripples communities by creating a self-fulfilling prophecy of egoism. Cohesi 2 explains. The premise that humans act to maximize utilities cues our view of ourselves, so the primary procurement of goods presents a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more we think of ourselves in terms of individual utility, the harder it becomes to propose public action by persons acting together. A life lived in common offers public happiness instead of generating a community. So if we ignore the community and start acting for ourselves and don't recognize our moral obligations to others, then the community will fall apart. Third, a lack of aid to those in utility perpetuates income inequality to threaten communal participation. Stand down. Two great factors between the rich and poor undermines the solidarity that institution provides as inequality deepens. The poor live increasingly separate lives. The affluent send their children to private schools, leaving at urban public schools, so the children and families who have not promoted a similar trend leads to the cessation of private privilege from other public institutions. Public institutions are to be center seats, a place where citizens from different walks of life encounter one another. The hauling of the public around makes it difficult to cultivate the solidarity and sense of community on which citizens have been trends. Dividing people of different incomes in such a way would create a huge irreparable rift in the community that can only be prevented by affirming. Finally, fourth, an obligation to aid others is necessary to correct communal norm mistakes. Slam Dell 2. Some special responsibilities I owe to those with my community who have a worldly born history of relation to the Germans or Jews or Americans to African Americans. Making amends for my country's past wrongs confers my allegiance to it. Solidarity gives us a special reason to criticize our own people. Patriotism can compel dissent. Take two grabs that led people to oppose the Vietnam War. One was that the war was at just, the other was that the war was at odds with who were as people. A Swede could oppose the Vietnam War, considered unjust, but only an American would feel ashamed of it. This would require an obligation to its others because only people who are in their own community can recognize their community's injustices and can take responsibility for them, even if they do not commit those actions. Thus, to correct those injustices, you must affirm.
Alright, can you restate your core value for me?
My value is morality.
Morality?
Yeah.
Okay, so is it moral to deprive people of their rights?
I mean, like, that depends what rights we're talking about and, like, what are we following.
Like, let's say to choose what to put in their own body. Should you tell each person that they should eat broccoli all the time?
My ethical theory only supports the idea that we have to preserve the community. And, like, beyond that.
I'm not sure if that answered the question.
Okay.
Is it moral to force someone to do what's good for them?
I mean, not under my conception of morality. It doesn't really matter in mine.
Alright, so can you restate the tagline for your observation one?
Sure. Observation 1 is simply that epistemology means you have to look to the community first.
Okay, so you use Charles Mills with your evidence there?
Yeah. But I use, no, in observation 1, I read Sayers 2, and Mills.
And Mills, okay, so could you just summarize those evidence cards for me?
Sure. So the first card in observation 1 about epistemology is Sayers, who says that we, in a community, we derive values from them, and it's like not voluntary. We inevitably do derive values from a community simply because we're influenced by like people around us who
Alright, so should those values be forced on us?
I mean, it's not a question of them being forced on us. Growing up in community means you, even if you don't accept those values, and that's explained later on in the case. So
if the community believes in genocide, would that be okay?
I mean, I explained that, like how that works later on. Can I?
Okay, sure.
Okay. So Sayers 2 says that the self develops from society because it's influenced by its origins. So even if like we don't agree with our societies, right? They still help to form our identities. So the argument I make is that, let's say you live in a society where genocide is encouraged. You may not agree with that like conception of genocide, but my argument is that that doesn't matter. What only matters is that that society taught you that conceptions of right and wrong exist. If you had not lived in that society, then to you everything would be permissible. Nothing would be wrong or good. So even if you don't agree that genocide is good, you still like think that some things are good and some things are bad.
So are you saying societal obligations are the same as moral obligations?
I make that link in the case.
Okay, thank you. Can you define your value criterion for me?
Sure. So the value criterion is the maintenance of communal norms that allows for society to flourish. And the argument is that when we preserve the society, right, we preserve morality. So to fulfill these moral, so I say, when we recognize moral obligations to assist people in need, we preserve the community, which in turn upholds morality.
So you're saying that we should follow the norms set forth by the community?
No, I'm saying that we should recognize that we have moral obligations to assist people in need.
Okay, so the value criterion is simply just affirming the resolution?
Well, it's preserving like the community and its ability to flourish.
Thank you.
I'll find prep.
Alright, I'll use some prep time. So I'm going to give my own case and then move on to mine. So, when I'm ready?
Yeah.
Get ready?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I negate the resolution that individuals have a moral obligation to assist those in need. I provide the following definition from Merriam-Webster Dictionary. Need, a lack of something requisite, desirable, or useful. From Merriam-Webster. The core value for the wrong would be justice, defined by Plato as giving each their due. Justice is essential to society because it provides legitimacy to that society. If people are given their due, the society as a whole can function effectively because citizens give their consent and allegiance only to a government which gives each their due and protects rights. Thus, justice is superior to all other values not only because it promotes moral correctness, but provides the basis on which societal operation and cohesiveness can flourish. The value criterion for the wrong will be maximizing moral autonomy. Moral autonomy is defined by Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy as the capacity to impose moral law on oneself. And, following Kant, it is claimed as a fundamental organizing principle of all morality. Furthermore, according to John Kreisman, a professor of philosophy and political science at Penn State, this form of autonomy directly pertains to any moral obligations. Thus, because of the focus and relativity of this criterion to the resolution, this is the superior criterion in the round. This by criterion is limited by the harm principle, and that autonomy should be maximized to the point in which autonomy of one person may infringe on the autonomy of another. Essentially, in order to maximize autonomy can only be increased to the point where autonomy conflicts with one another. Maximizing autonomy can only be achieved on the negative because the resolution's mandate to help those in need is paternalistic. Or in other words, infringing on the rights of individuals to preserve social status, choose what to put in their own body, etc. Maximizing autonomy, or through maximizing autonomy, you maximize justice by maximizing the rights and liberties of all individuals, and, therefore, those people will consent to and contribute greatly to their government. Observation 1. The wording of need could pertain to any number of things considered requisite or desirable. According to Pew Research Center, the majority of Americans consider computers, TVs, sets, cars, and car air conditioning necessities. Contention 1. The resolution violates autonomy through liberty-limiting principles. John Stuart Mill and Joel Feinberg both claim that the only acceptable limit to place on an individual's autonomy is the harm principle. Essentially, they say that the only morally justified limit on a person's free will is that one cannot inflict harm on one another. Anything further, such as the beneficence the affirmative breaches, begins advocating the principles of paternalism. This means that citizens will lose their autonomy unjustly. Once you place wrongful expectations of beneficence on someone, you condemn those morally who simply don't deserve it because they have a right to their own self-preservation before beneficence to another. Thus, affirming the resolution would be supporting paternalism unjustly. Therefore, we must negate the resolution to preserve autonomy. By protecting individuals' rights, we achieve justice. Contention 2. Imposing help on those in need violates justice. According to David Reef, writer for New York Times and the author of The New Republic, giving aid is by definition people deciding what is right for a person without that person's consent. In fact, aid violates agency as much as forcing someone to eat broccoli because it's good for them. Both are paternalistic expectations and violate moral autonomy. Thus, in order to have a just society, we must negate the resolution. By doing this, those in need and those who would give to those in need preserve their individual liberties and will consent to their government. Contention 3. As long as someone is a rational being, interfering with moral autonomy disrespects individual worth. According to John Kreisman, a professor of philosophy and political science at Penn State, as long as an individual has not lost the ability to reflexively consider their options and make choices, if I intervene against her will, for her own good, I show less respect for her as a person than if I allow her to make her own mistakes. This essentially says that making decisions for someone, even if it benefits them, devalues them, which is obviously wrong. Thus, by affirming the resolution, you morally violate moral autonomy and devalue individuals. By negating, you give moral autonomy and achieve justice. Now moving on to my opponent's case. He talks about in his framework that it would only punish people ethically, that they would only be violating ethics, so they still have the option to violate this moral obligation. Firstly, as he talks about, society acts upon these moral obligations. So if you violate that moral obligation, there must be some punishment in place. And secondly, punishing someone ethically is still paternalistic because you're violating their moral autonomy, their ability to choose what is right or wrong for themselves past the point of the harm principle. Then moving on, he talks about that you would only have to help someone if there is no other help. However, assisting those in need, even if there's a limited amount of help for someone, you still would be required to help that person in any way possible. You would be forced to give even minor financial aid, which would take from you and violate your autonomy. Then with his observation 1, he talks about because we are born into society, we follow that moral conduct and we must abide by it. However, I'm not even sure how this achieves the resolution. He's just saying that society determines morals and that you don't have a choice to them. Firstly, that's paternalistic. And secondly, society is a lot of times wrong in they've justified horrible tragedies such as the Holocaust. So this observation is saying that it's okay for that to happen, that society should be determining moral obligations, which is wrong. Then with his core value of morality, I would like to point out that this isn't even achieved. In his CX, he admitted that forcing someone to, or deciding what someone should do, or forcing them to do something that benefits them is wrong, and that it doesn't fit into his core value of morality. He admitted that. So by affirming the resolution, by forcing people to do this, even if the action benefits all of society, it's still wrong because you're violating their rationality, and as long as they are a rational agent, you have an obligation to let them choose their obligations. And then with his 5 criterion of maintenance of human norms, firstly, human norms are, again, not necessarily good, because the norm of the society might be the Holocaust. This isn't affirming the resolution. There's no norm in society right now saying that we should be assisting those in need, so we wouldn't be abiding by any social norm. And then he talks about in there that we need to preserve these connections between people. We need to help these people interact with one another. However, this is not achieved in the affirmative world because they're just blindly following a higher power. When you become a slave of your mind, when you lose your rationality to a higher power, you lose the ability to interact healthily between citizens. And because of this, you're not achieving this interaction between people. You're not achieving anything other than a forced obligation to help those in need. So again, it's taking away the sentiment of helping whoever's in need. So you're not actually increasing interaction, you're just forcing people to do something, which that person won't be thankful for. They'll understand that the person helping them is only acting out of an obligation, not actually helping them because that's what the person wanted to do. You're not actually promoting that helpfulness between society. And then he talks about altruism in there, that you need to have these altruistic bonds between people. However, the resolution would make it so that assisting any person in need would not be altruistic. You're just looking out for your own self. You're looking out to avoid guilt. You're looking out to avoid personal consequences. So you're not actually acting altruistically towards the people in society because you're just being paternalized. You're losing your autonomy. You're not acting rationally. And so, therefore, you cannot affirm the resolution, and this argument falls. And then justice supersedes his core value of morality because justice takes into account the rights of each person. Just because it's what's moral doesn't mean just because you're forcing morality on someone, it doesn't make it the correct thing to do. And for all these reasons, I see nothing but negative.
So, first let's talk about the negative case. Why does decreasing human worth violate autonomy?
Well, I'm saying violating autonomy decreases human worth.
No, but my question is, okay, so the third contention, the Prius card, right?
Yes.
He says that when we intervene, then we're less, when we intervene, right, then we decrease, the other person's worth, whoever's receiving the aid. Why does that violate their autonomy? Why does decreasing human worth mean anything in terms of, autonomy?
Well, actually what he's talking about there is that acting paternalistically, making decisions for them, that's what violates, you're violating their autonomy inherently by choosing what to do for them, and then that disrespects individual worth. Okay, but why does disrespecting individual worth matter in and of itself? Because individuals have a right to be recognized. That's the whole purpose of life, is to have worth in your life. And by violating that, you're taking away the purpose of each individual person. Okay, so does the criterion deal with individual worth as well, or just autonomy? Is it dealing with both? Your criterion. Sorry, I don't. Your criterion of preserving autonomy. Does that deal with? Well, the contention 3 was talking about negative consequences of violating that autonomy. Okay, but we only care about violating autonomy in and of itself, right? That's what the criterion says. I'm not sure what the question is. That's fine. Let's move on. So when you say that, let's talk about violating autonomy. So why does the harm principle apply to Kant's theory of autonomy? Well, I was talking about John Stuart Mill and Joel Feinberg there, and they're talking about if you do anything past the harm principle, if you mandate anything morally, past just forcing people not to harm each other, then that's paternalistic. So they're saying that forcing people to give to one another is paternalistic. Okay, what's the difference between justice and morality? I would say that justice takes into account a lot of the practice of it and the rights of the people, whereas morality could just be wrong. Are they linked or are they independent of one another? Does morality uphold justice? Does justice uphold morality? I would say that justice achieves a moral society. Okay, so justice achieves morality. Got it. Okay. Okay, so what are the independent justifications for the criterion? Why the criterion is good, I guess. Firstly, because it allows people to make rational decisions. I talked about in there, It like directly pertains to moral obligations, which is why it supersedes.
Anything
the
else?
criterion. It's also good because it allows, because because it allows interaction between citizens.
And is that it?
Yeah.
Okay, got it. Thank you. So I'll use prep now. I'll just tag it off myself. Can I see the citation for your definition of need?
Oh, that's in my case section.
If you could pass it over. Where's the citation?
The MLA citation?
Yeah. Or website or something.
It's Merriam-Webster, which is the website. So 120 left. And I'll be going first on the AC and then on the MC. Is everybody ready? I'm ready.
Okay. All right. Go to the AC. The clear problem impacting the AC is that, first of all, he doesn't respond to any of the internal warrants in the cards. It just makes random analytical arguments as overviews of the AC, but he's concerning internal warrants. And second of all, he's not being responsive anyways. First, let's go to the definition of in need, which he defines as something that is desirable, something that is needed. But first of all, he provides absolutely no citation as to where he got that definition from. Whereas I do, and even if that doesn't matter in this debate, remember that in need means something like in need implies that we have something that's like the lacking basic necessities. He doesn't contest this anyways, so my definition of in need is conceded. We're looking to people who lack basic necessities, not someone who just wants a toy or something. That doesn't make sense. So that's going to be functionally taking out an argument later in the NC. That's going to be important, like in the NC level debate. Then go to the argument about how it's only finding in terms of reality. He says that first of all, society acts upon like our obligations, society forces us to our obligations, but that's not my argument. My argument is that when we realize these obligations, if we were to act on them, that would be good, but you don't have to act on them in terms of like you don't have to act on them, but even if you do act on them, he said that an ethical punishment is it's still bad, but he doesn't prove why any sort of ethical punishment is still bad, like why there's a link to guilt or whatever. If people don't want to do something, then they won't feel necessarily guilty about not doing it. That doesn't matter. If they were to feel guilty, then they could do it anyways. So that doesn't make sense. But these definitional arguments are not going to be important as observation one, which is going to be key in this debate. His only arguments don't respond to Sayers' So his only arguments are that, number one, it doesn't respond to it, like the link to the resolution. It doesn't need to link it to the resolution. It needs to link it to morality because that's the value. Also, he says that it's like paternalistic, but that's just a term on the potential level, not an argument for why epistemology is wrong. And finally, he says that societies can be wrong. But again, I explained in the AC why that's not my argument. My argument is that if societies form a conception of right and wrong, even if we disagree with our societies, we still form some sort of conception of, well, there's some sort of idea of right and wrong. So, without a society, we wouldn't be able to do that. We just assume that everything is permissible. He's conceding Sayers too, which says that the self-develops in society because it is influenced by its origins. Therefore, our identities are formed of the community, and they influence our values and moral systems. That's the only way to understand morality is in the context of a community. I established this in the AC, and this is conceded, which means that epistemologically, observation 1 is going to be precluding the negative case and all of the offense under it, because epistemology, that how we know morality is. We must acknowledge the ways in which we understand morality, which is a function of the community. Therefore, for any conception of morality to exist, we must look at the community first. So my ethical theory precludes. The MC does not matter anymore. It's gone now. Because he doesn't link it to morality. He talks about autonomy, which does not deal with the community at all. So, once that's true, go to observation 2 at the ethical framework. First, he says that he violates autonomy, but that's just a response. That's just repeating his own case, not proving to me why that's bad for the community. Also, he says that justice accounts for rights, but we're going to be looking to morality in this debate because he says in cross-examination that justice ultimately leads to morality. So that means that the goal of justice, anyway, is to look to morality. Since the value is whatever we have to look to that's highest in the debate, we have to look to morality first because he concedes that in cross-examination. Also, I never conceded in CX that I want to be valuing autonomy. I said that valuing autonomy doesn't matter in terms of my moral theory. He misunderstood me. So, he drops Gilsing, which says that living in society means to identify with its accomplishments and failures, and thus we help societies and communities. That's conceded reasons to prefer the value criterion of maintenance of communal norms that allow for the communities to flourish. He just makes lots of analytics about how it leads to the Holocaust, but this is just again a repeating of his arguments. I've already refuted this. The only other argument is that he's not grateful, but that doesn't matter. We don't need to be grateful. So once that's true, he's conceding the entire contention level. The main argument is going to be Clohessy 2, which says that selfishness is a self-fulfilling prophecy of egoism because we lean less and less towards public collateral action and the community collapses. This is the only offense under the AC standard. Since we're only looking to the AC standard epistemologically, I'm precluding. But even if that's not true, go to the NC. I'm already proving the value of justice. You're not going to be looking to that. That takes out the link to autonomy because he only proves that justice links to autonomy, not morality. Furthermore, his only two reasons are that it's rational, but he assumes rationality. First, and also, not all people are rational, so that means that he's excluding people, so there's no equality. Third, he never defines rationality. His second justification is about interaction, but a community, this just feeds into my argument because I'm saying that communities form interactions more. He doesn't prove by those interactions, and also the harm principle limits interactions anyways. So, the contention level doesn't matter. The innate argument precludes the David analysis, and finally, the arguments about violating autonomy don't matter because people can choose to be moral. Therefore, you affirm.
Yeah. Alright, opponent ready? Or ready? Okay. So I'm going to start with rebuilding my output and then move on to the affirmative. Alright, so he simply attacks justice by saying that, like, morality precludes, or morality is the goal of justice. However, justice, I didn't admit during cross-examination that justice is part of morality. I said that justice creates a moral society. So I'm trying to achieve a moral society, whereas he's just trying to achieve morality among the citizens in a society. For instance, morality among the citizens in society cannot be a good thing by trying to impose that on people. I will use the example of Maximilien Robespierre during the French Revolution. He wanted everybody to be beneficent to another. He wanted everyone to be giving to one another and act nicely to one another. And he mandated this through simply moral obligations. However, this created a horrible society in which everybody was fearful of the government. Everybody did not actually act out of the way that they wanted to. It was completely paternalistic. And this example shows that morality is not necessarily good. It doesn't necessarily mean a just society. A just society gives autonomy to each of the individuals, whereas the resolution is depriving people of that. Then, I'm not even sure if he truly attacked my value criterion. He says that he may have simplified it just saying that he took out the link between maximizing autonomy and justice, or I'm not even sure if he truly addressed it. And then moving on to my contentions, he just simplified them all to one thing so that he did not need to address them. However, that is wrong. He does need to address, at least analytically, each of those contentions, which he does not do. He simply just does an overview of each one of them, which is completely wrong. They are different things. And so, therefore, he has no response to those. Then he talks about how my definition of need doesn't have citation and all that stuff. Firstly, the merit of my definition still stands, but I would like to move on to his definition. He just says that it's a physiological need. He doesn't just define what any of those physiological needs are. He doesn't define each of the things, the parts that would be included with someone in need, whereas I provide that. People would consider a car a need because in order to make their living, in order to get food and sustenance and achieve shelter, they need to be able to, or they need a car to be able to get to work in America. That's considered a need in America. And so that argument falls. Now moving on to my opponent's case. So firstly, he talks about the community will collapse with his value criterion if we do not have people helping one another. However, community collapses because these people do not have any sense of rationality. They will be just blindly following a higher power. Community collapses because there's no true interaction between people. It's simply action out of a moral obligation. And then I would also like to bring up, he talks about that the moral obligation in this round would not have any, that people would just not be able to follow it. Firstly, under that rationale, the resolution isn't achieving anything in the affirmative world. He's saying that people will still not be able to follow it and not feel guilt and everything. So he's being completely abusive with that. Like, if people have a moral obligation, there must firstly be some sort of, people will reject him because of that. If a person does not follow that moral obligation, people will reject him because he disobeyed this social norm, this moral obligation. So firstly, there are negative consequences to not following a moral obligation. That's completely abusive for him to say that nobody will feel guilt if they violate that moral obligation. That's like the entire premise of a moral obligation, that if people violate that moral obligation not to steal from someone, for instance, then they feel guilty for that. By imposing that moral obligation, you'd be deciding whether or not a person feels guilty, which, as I've said through my John Stuart Mill and Joel Flamer, they both say that that is wrong, that is paternalistic to decide someone's morals and decide what they must do. Then I would also like to talk about his core value of morality. I already addressed this with the Maximilien Robespierre example. Morality is not necessarily a good thing. Just because you force everyone in society to act morally doesn't mean that that's the right thing to do, because you're violating their autonomy, you're violating the interaction between people, and there will be consequences for each of those people to violate that. If not societally, if not they're being put in jail, then they're just feeling guilty for it, which is wrong, as I've proven. And then he says that, again, the only argument I would like to stress that he made against my case in that last speech was that justice is just trying to achieve the higher goal of morality. Firstly, it's trying to achieve a moral society. Like, he completely misquoted me in his speech. And I would like to say he barely addressed the entirety of my case. He did not address any of my contentions. And he talks about me dropping like specific cards. However, I addressed them at least analytically, where he did not even address each one of my things specifically. I at least addressed them analytically. And first off, that is enough in this round. I don't need to address every single little card that he had in his case. I addressed it because it's paternalistic. I took that out with all of my cards. So therefore, he does not stand in this round. And then now moving on to some voting issues. Firstly, my opponent should lose the round simply on the fact that he barely addressed my case. He focused mainly on his case. He barely addressed it in his rebuttal, which is, just because of that, he should lose. He dropped the majority of those contentions. He dropped saying that imposing help on those in need would be paternalistic. He didn't even respond to that in any way. During any of the speech, he didn't bring up any analytical thing saying that imposing help on someone, like deciding whether or not they need help, is paternalistic. And then I'd also like to say, if he tries and bring back the definition of need, if he tries